Thing is, thank you for coming out. I'm deeply grateful that I've had opportunity to be part of this program. You know, what made it possible is the People's Educational Program. I became involved with them because I wanted to have an opportunity to pass on a body of knowledge and information to a new generation about how our country thinks, behave, and tick. And People's Educational Project, it gives me that opportunity. There's some people I just like to mention because they have been very kind to me. You already saw Leanne. She has been just wonderful in pulling together an educational program here. Kevin has personally helped get me here. He's helped acclimate me to my circumstances. Then you have the people running the place like Manolo and Brother David. I just like to give them a kind shout out because I absolutely love this space. I remember when it was being planned. It wasn't here a year ago. So when I come up and see it, it's just wonderful and it's magnificent because it gives us a place and an opportunity to talk about things. Max mentioned that we have communicated actually on and off for probably a couple of decades. So I'm just elated that I had an opportunity to meet him in the flesh and stuff. When you look at Revolution in the Air, and it is a book worth owning, his introduction begins with the first 4 months in 1968. And it begins in 1968 because it was a huge year of change. You know, one of the things that happened in 1968 was a strike in Detroit, Michigan, that happened May 1968 at an old Chrysler plant, the Dodge main plant. And it was the kind of strike that began to change what was taking place in America. To understand it, though, I want to jump back and forth through history because, no, I want to say something else first. The reason we do this is because we are looking to educate people. Mm-hmm. We are fighting for the life of the mind. Mm-hmm. We are not looking for disgruntled, discontent people. We are looking for people who have the capacity to think, who have the ability to create a vision for people in this country that's worth fighting for. The reason that's important because we're undergoing this tremendous activity that's starting to take place. Ever since Trump got elected, time has sped up. All of us can feel it, right? And what happened was something so amazing. One day after Trump was inaugurated, one of the biggest demonstrations in the history of America took place, organized and led predominantly by women. And I'm mentioning this because the hardest thing in life to do is to find your moment in history. It took us 30, 40 years to figure out how to find our moment in history. Now, the reason we study and read things and what drove us to Marxism, right? We wanted to make sense of the world we live in. On that note, I want to go back and just run through some aspects of my life so we know who each other are and what it is that motivate us. Growing up, all I wanted to do was be a good boy. I honestly wanted to be good, and I wanted to do the right thing because I was raised by a couple of parents who had a certain kind of morality. And they taught us that we should oppose evil, that we should stand up for right because that's how human beings lived. So when I grew up with that morality with a sense of fairness that was kind of built into us. And being in Detroit back then, it was an epicenter of this incredible movement that was taking place. It's hard to tell now, but in the past century, Detroit was to Michigan and America what Silicon Valley is to California and America today. It's hard to see it, but the automobile industry was the classical home of technological innovation. And because of that, we stayed at the cutting edge of a very powerful movement. The world I'm from is not your world. I am not of your world. I am of a world that was birthed on the basis of the Industrial Revolution, the last phase of it. Specifically a period of history we call Fordism. Fordism as a system, it changed life in America and around the world. Henry Ford revolutionized how production took place in this country. And because of that, a factory system was created that amalgamated thousands of people together under one roof. That amalgamation made it possible for us to develop a different kind of collective way of living. People who did not like each other, after you work with the same person year after year on the assembly line, you get to know who they are, who their family is, and you start bonding together a certain way. So I grew up under conditions where my reality was what can be described as industrial reality. We had industrial time frames, and we had a very different way of looking at things. By the time I was a teenager, the social movement inside of the country was heating up. For me, 1968 was important because a year earlier, 1967 Detroit, July was one of the greatest uprisings to take place in this country. Mm-hmm. And the uprising changed the architecture of the country, but I want to talk about it a little bit before I advance forward. What happened was you had a group of people who were hanging out at what they call a blind pig. In Detroit, we call them an after-hour joint. When you get off of work, if you had a little money and stuff, you would go take you a shower, you would get your girl or whoever you was with, and you would go to the after-hours club, right? Where they sold liquor after hours, and you would come in. Anyway, one weekend, the police decided to bust this after-hour joint, and it was the catalyst that caused the rebellion. I want to look at it because you have to understand that the only people who could attend and patronize the after-hour joint is people with money, because you had to be able to afford the food, the drink, the dance, and you always had a little gambling in the back. And I'm saying that because what incited the rebellion in Detroit was attacking the better paid sections of the working class. When we think about these rebellions and riots, for different reasons we conjure this picture of deep poverty. And it's not like that. And we need to catch up with who we are and what kind of country we live in, because from my point of view, actually from the point of view of this, it looked like a meeting of old men, right? Because, I mean, that's what we are. But we're reaching a point in our country that's pretty exciting and stuff. Now, in 1968, we had what was called a drum strike, right? It took place in a Dodge main plant. At this Dodge main plant, it was this huge structure that held 10,000 people making Dodge automobiles. The work was hot, dirty, and dangerous, but we were the highest paid industrial workers in the world. And I'm saying that because our country went through a curve of development, right, where you could actually make a living in this country. I remember as a young man being able to make a living. It's important because my dad worked for Ford Motor Company. When he passed, he had 38 years seniority at Ford Rouge, and he was one of the earlier black laborers that was able to work his way into skilled trades. Mm-hmm. He died an electrician and stuff. So when I come up under that kind of system where I was trained not only in a household, but even in school. The world we lived in was profoundly industrial. In school, they taught us how to acclimate ourselves to this industrial system. The civil rights movement, it had an impact in Detroit. And because we were highly organized, we were able to do things in Detroit that you couldn't do in most places. You know, the Detroit '67 riot, it was significant because we have SWAT teams today and these highly military police force, but back then we didn't. Back then, the rebellion in Detroit, what it did is cause the collapse of the police departments around the country, because it became evident that the way they were set up, they could no longer control this moving section of the working class. It was under those conditions that I was able to develop my consciousness about the world around me and stuff. I was 15, actually, when I decided to join the revolutionary movement in a serious way. You know, at 16, I got my first job in the automobile industry, working for General Motors against my parents' permission. They wanted all of us to go to school, get degrees, become accomplished, you know, doctors, lawyers, and things like that. But I knew at 16 that I could go into the factory and make a man's wage and marry the girl I always loved. And, you know, I didn't quite do that, but you know what I mean? But I ended up in the factory, and I ended up working for Chrysler, which afforded me an opportunity to make a man's wage and have a decent living. Let me back up a little bit. I want to talk about some of the things in this book also. One of the things, I'm going to jump in that back and forth. One of the things I like about the book is, and everybody should have their own copy. You should. It's like an encyclopedia of what happened. It instructs you on who did what. I forget what chapter it's in, but Max talked about how one of the distinguishing characteristics of this period was the energy that people had, right? Because we come out of a time frame of optimism, totally different from today. You knew that you could make a living in this country. You knew you could carve yourself out another way of life. You knew you could leave home, right? And didn't have to live up under your parents. So we had a different way of viewing things that was deeply optimistic. We honestly believed in our ability to cause and effect change. And that gave us a different sense and a different purpose. We had people like Muhammad Ali, who literally in front of the world refused to fight. And we had in Detroit Motown music, right? We had this whole new culture that was taking shape, that was based on the industrial system, that made it so that we were able to accomplish things beyond our imagination, right? We never felt like we was just single individuals. But when Max come out with his book back in 1901, I looked at it, and today I feel a lot different about it. I can respect it a lot more nowadays because I can understand, well, you get older, you become kinder, right? You become more patient, you become more forgiving. That way, when you go to hell, you might have a chance, right? You just might, okay. But no, it's honestly an encyclopedia of events that happened, and it tells you the different organizations that were in play. And if you look at them, what you had in motion was a couple of 100,000 people who wanted to make sense of the world in which they live and who dedicated their lives to studying and teaching and fighting to make the world a better place. I think we have reached a point in time in this country where that can happen again, but only at a different level. Let me jump back to 1968. We had this Dodge main strike, right, that involved 10,000 workers. And they called it a wildcat strike, right? A wildcat strike is an unauthorized strike on the part of the workforce. It was 2 strikes in 1968. In most books, they tell you about the second strike, which was kind of inaugurated by a group of black workers. But the first strike wasn't. The one they never talk about, it was inaugurated by Polish workers. It was a woman in the plant, a Polish woman, right, who had enough. And she refused to work, and everybody supported her. Dodge, Maine, you have to understand, was in a city adjacent to Detroit called Hamtramck. Hamtramck, Pollockville, right? Is that derogatory? Yeah. Okay, well, give me another word. Teach me. What do I call it? Poland. Poletown. Poletown. Okay, sorry about that. Like, correct me. I'm an old man. No, I'll give. Don't beat me. No, but the first strike, which was significant, was inaugurated by a woman, right? And that first strike is what taught people how to come together and how to go on strike. These factories now were entire cities. They weren't just small shops like we have nowadays. In these factories, you could get anything you needed because they operated literally like little cities and stuff. So you had this city within a city. And on Friday, you had the society was structured different. On Fridays, you would have these brink trucks that would come up to the factory. I see you shaking your head. That's how you would cash your check. And the women would be lined up because they would be trying to get to the paycheck before the husband ended up giving the money to the man in the tavern, right? and well, that's been part of the whole struggle that women have waged since after the Civil War, the fight over the paycheck, right? The fight against the man in the tavern, But you had these people who were conditioned this way. So when this strike exploded, everybody in the city understood something was happening very different. And before we knew it, we had people coming from plants around the city demanding that we help them and set up an organization. Now, the reason this organization was set up by black workers was that when you have, Max mentioned some of the legislation in the 60s. The way America is set up is very complicated. When you pass a new law, there's no way for it to take effect until somebody fight to implement the law, and that compels a movement of the judiciary and the court system where they have to set up things so that policy can be implemented, and then you have a system to check on the policy. So this movement that's taking place is compelling all these corresponding changes within government and stuff. And we didn't know any of this. We're trying to learn how to navigate it. But the 1968 drum strike, it inaugurated what would become the last great strike wave in American history. It ran from roughly 1968 to 1974. The problem is that when you're in the middle of a strike wave, you cannot tell when it peaked until after the fact, right? So what happened was, with the civil rights movement going, 68 was critical. Stokely Carmichael raised the slogan of Black Power, and Black Power was a slogan that became an electoral movement, right? In Detroit, that meant electing our first black mayor, Coleman Young. What was different about Detroit was, after we elected Coleman Young, we began to elect Marxists and communists to office. And it was the only place that this happened in Detroit. Now, the definitive book on that is called Detroit, I Do Mind Dying. You might be able to find a PDF online if you search good. But it describes this process that took place in Detroit. What I'm trying to get to is how these social movements, a catalyst occur, and people behavior start changing, right, in the most unexpected ways. Before 67, when you told people you were being harassed by the police, the first thing they would ask you, well, what did you do? Well, how come the police bothering you? After 67 and 68, when you talked about being harassed by the police, everybody cursed the police because they begin to understand their role differently. And I'm beginning to see that here today. See, we are experiencing a certain point in history where there's a continuum. From my point of view, things shifted in 2012, September 19th, with the Occupy movement. Then the next major shift was Trayvon Martin, right? And what I noticed about Trayvon Martin was something I've never seen before in America. I'm at home watching some of this movement take place on television, and I can't help but notice that the majority of demonstrations are white. And I said, this is extremely interesting. Now, they don't show things like that on television anymore. But when they first exploded, the news would cover them in a way where you could actually see what was taking place. Trayvon Martin, for some reason I can't totally account for, it caused a shift in the country. Then you had the incident here in New York with Eric Garner. Then you had Mike Brown in Ferguson, right? So you have this escalation that's taking place that led up to, ultimately, Donald Trump, and the next day, all hell broke loose with one of the biggest demonstrations in American history. Now, my point is that we are beginning to understand where we are in history. In the 60s and 70s, we simply did not know because we had not been through that process before. Where we are in history is at a point where we can affect the thinking of this country in a way that's fundamentally different from anything that has happened since the Civil War, right? What I do is go back and try to look at the elements of American history. Abraham Lincoln's Civil War, he had something to do that was incredible. He had to try to convince the American people to oppose slavery when they didn't. See, in our country, like, I mean, one, we're stupid, right? You know, we just have a dumb country. And there's reasons for that. No, well, we don't have to remain stupid, that's the point. We can learn, we can become educated. But Abraham Lincoln had to try to deal with a working class that was not against slavery. They was not against slavery, but they was against the slaves, right? They was not against slavery, but they was against the slaves in the same way that when Occupy Wall Street broke out, everybody was against the banks, but not against the financial system, right? Because you have the formation of consciousness, right? Abraham Lincoln had to do things in such a way where the border states would not be driven into the arms of the Confederacy. And I think we have to look at things like that. How can we do things where we just don't drive people away from us, right? Because we're at a point in time now where if we can figure out how to come together and network and incubate a new movement, which is why this place is here, we will be able to affect the destiny of this country, and I don't say that lightly. Is my time up?
It's about up.
Okay. I can come back. You know what I'm talking about? Okay, well, I'll keep going a little bit. But I'm saying it because I want to capture, like, our moment in history, where we're at, why this place exists.
Yeah, go on.
See, it's a purpose behind this place. It has been thought out, right? And we know this time around that we have to do things in a way where we figure out a new vision for our country. And I'm not sure exactly what the vision should be, but it should be of a new society where every human being has an opportunity to contribute every day of their life. When we talk about things, when I talk about things like Marxism and communism, I'm not talking about pie in the sky. I'm talking about a world in which I can get up every day and contribute something to the betterment of humanity rather than me spend my life making $7.50, $8 an hour, minimum wage, where life is just hard and you never can reach a level of enlightenment. And I'm saying it like that because we in the world now, I mean, it didn't exist when I was here. Y'all don't understand how the young people, this is a miracle. It's a miracle. It's another technological regime. And my point is that when you change the technology in a society, society is forced to reorganize itself around a new technology. That whole process is what's meant by social revolution. Social revolution is the process of organizing yourself around new means of production. I come out of Detroit, and the point about what was dynamic in Detroit was it represented the new means of production from the 1919 and 1920 on, so that the working class in that city would be at the front curve of history. We thought we could go into revolution because we didn't understand the dynamics of society. One thing we learned is that as long as a system is developing, it can be reformed. And it doesn't make sense at first, but what it means is that when the industrial workers fought for a better wage, they were able to reform the system. When they fought for a pension, they were able to reform the system because the industrial system was still developing. Anytime you have a system still developing, no matter how hard you fight, you can't overthrow it. By overthrow it, I mean you overthrowing the political structures in society and you bringing somebody new to power who can carry out your will. The technological revolution means that the old system we lived under has come to an end. Reform is no longer possible, not because we become angry or revolutionary, but because the system itself can't be reformed. Reform is change in a system that doesn't change the property relations. That's something we had to learn. We couldn't get that from Lenin, although we read Lenin diligently, right? We couldn't get it from Mao, and I read Mao diligently. It's something we had to discover. But my point is that we have reached this juncture in history where the system can no longer be reformed. We're teetering whether or not the country is going to become just truly barbaric and fascistic, and it doesn't have to. However, we are required to do our part.
Yes.
Our part means learning how to network in a new way. Our part means, yes, getting a copy of Revolution in the Air, and you can find it online for free, but, you know, go and buy it. You can find it online, but go and spend a few bucks, you know what I mean? But in a few
the
words,
brother out. Help the
that's,
brother out.
you know what I'm saying, man? Because Max be starving, you know what I'm talking about.
gotta
You
help
see
your
how
brother
thin,
out,
you
man.
see how thin he is. He be starving, man. But the point is that we honestly can make a difference. 10 years ago, we couldn't. Today, we can make a material difference in how this country behaves, how it thinks. But the key is us learning how to develop a coherent vision
Yes.
of a new society, of a new tomorrow. On those words, let me pass the ball to Willie, because we can get questions and jump back and forth.
Yeah, okay, very good.